The Galac's Sixth Fleet spent 4 solid months studying Earth's disaster meteorology. They calculated the exact destructive yield of storm surges, timing their strike for the precise moment Category 4. Hurricane Helena made landfall on the Florida coast. According to the Alien War College's doctrines, stacking a natural disaster on top of an extraterrestrial invasion would shatter humanity's psychological defenses within 3 minutes. But they missed one fatal local variable, FEMA's Waffle House Index. At 2:30 a.m., with winds howling at 130 miles per hour and floodwaters cresting the sidewalks, alien assault Captain Carus kicked in the only illuminated glass door left on Highway 98, ready to read the Declaration of Enslavement. Instead, he was greeted by the sizzling smell of frying bacon and a waitress named Brenda behind the counter. "Shut the door, hun. You're letting the draft in?" Brenda said, not even looking up as she poured black coffee into a chipped white ceramic mug. "Grab a seat wherever, but we're running on the generator tonight, so the jukebox is busted." Carus's silver-gray assault armor was still dripping with the hypersaline rain of the hurricane. He couldn't process why this human female was completely unfazed by the Empire's arrival. The tactical manual dictated he must immediately establish dominance and crush her will to resist. The ammo chute on his left armor snapped open. He drew his plasma rifle, its chassis glowing with a ghostly blue energy reserve, and locked it firmly into his shoulder pocket, aiming the muzzle dead at Brenda's chest. His modulated, booming synthetic voice rattled the glass doorframe. "Insignificant carbon-based indigenes, cease your resistance immediately and kneel before the Galax." The rest of the declaration caught in his throat. The grip of the plasma rifle instantly heated up enough to melt its own armor coating, and a piercing short-circuit alarm fried Carus's auditory chips with a burst of static. The salty, muddy water that had washed into the rifle's cooling vents during the downpour had already clogged every precision ventilation groove. The salt corroded right through the circuit insulation. Blue and white electrical sparks violently arced out of the gun's seams, and the energy core began to emit an unstable, heavy hum. Panicking, Carus let go. The scalding rifle clattered onto the tile floor. A floor caked in decades of fossilized bacon grease, bounced and cracked him hard right in the shin. Aside from the roar of the hurricane battering the glass and the sizzle of bacon on the griddle, the only sound left in the diner was the sputtering, screeching short circuit of the Empire's top-tier energy weapon. Brenda didn't even bat an eye. She wiped the grease off her hands, grabbed a laminated menu smeared with maple syrup and butter fingerprints, and marched over in her mud-caked black work boots. Smack! She slapped the menu dead center onto Carus's cold, glowing chest plate. In the shadowy corner, 2 linemen wrapped in soaked, reflective vests turned to look. Mike's fingertips barely brushed the stiff, crumpled bills in his jeans pocket before he whipped out a rolled-up 20 and slapped it onto a table sticky with maple syrup. The other lineman, Jimmy, tugged at his drenched vest, dug out his own 20, and slapped it down on top of Mike's. His Adam's apple bobbed. "Bettin' the Tin Man keeps his feet. Imperial troopers gotta know how to walk, right?" Mike took a swig of lukewarm black coffee, wincing at the bitterness, his eyes dead-locked on the alien assault infantryman at the door. "Bullshit. This floor's been marinatin' in 40 years of bacon grease. It's slicker N.A. curling rink. Last time I came in here lugging 10 coils of wire, I busted my ass. Look at him. Smooth metal suit, flat-bottom boots with 0 tread. Put over 100 pounds of armor on that. Hez going down." Carus still hadn't recovered from the chaos of his short-circuiting plasma rifle. The butter-smeared plastic menu was stuck to his chest plate, and his battered shin throbbed with every pulse. He took a step forward, intending to rip away the offending piece of plastic, and planted his smooth combat boot squarely onto the grease-soaked tile. His heel aggressively slipped 6 inches to the side. The armor's servo joints whined with an ear-piercing overload alert. Carus tipped sideways, frantically reaching out to grab a nearby bar stool, but his fingertips only grazed a leg caked in shortening. He wobbled violently, his broad shoulders crashing into the hanging cutlery rack with a massive clatter. He looked like a lead-weighted clown on roller skates, completely unable to find his center of gravity. Mike slammed his coffee mug on the table and leaned in, waiting to hear the 200-pound tin man hit the deck. Suddenly, the diner's incandescent lights flickered and the voltage began to drop. In low Earth orbit, inside the command bridge of the Gal-Ax 6th Fleet's anti-gravity assault craft, Seur's purplish-black carapace gleamed under the cold light of the holographic projection. He furrowed the smooth brow ridges characteristic of an elite commander, staring at the live feed from the probe. There was Carus, covered in highly saline floodwater, slipping and staggering across the greasy tiles. Two human indigenes in grease-stained work clothes were huddled in a corner, with two $20 bills sitting perfectly neat on the table, showing absolutely zero of the panic expected during an interstellar invasion. It was completely incomprehensible. Seur had mentally simulated hundreds of flawless world-conquering tactics. A blackout was supposed to instantly crush any civilization's will to resist. These primitive humans obviously hadn't realized their doom yet. His silicon-coated fingertip had been hovering over the master console's kill switch for 3 seconds. Now it descended. The touch was cold and hard. The button clicked softly. A half-second later, a sea-green confirmation prompt popped up on the main screen. Civilian primary power grid meltdown complete within 30-mile radius. All power nodes offline. Seur leaned back into his climate-controlled command chair, pulling up the planetary electrical signal map. Every facility reliant on the municipal grid had turned into a gray dead zone. Only that tiny Waffle House still emitted a faint primary power signal, and it was decaying rapidly. He could already picture the tiny primitive humans on his screen, screaming in terror, blindly crashing into things in the absolute pitch black, giving Carus plenty of room to sweep the area. He tapped his fingertips on the armrest, waiting for the thermal imaging to show the frantic jumping red dots of total chaos. The glaring fluorescent main lights in the diner slowly began to dim. In an instant, the only sound left in the diner was the shriek of the hurricane smashing against the glass. Chuck muttered a low curse at the flat-top grill, which still held half a slab of frying bacon. He wiped his greasy gloves on his apron and bent down to grab a 2-foot heavy-duty pipe wrench from under the prep counter. The decades-old congealed beef tallow stuck in the wrench's jaws was hard as welded iron, its sheer weight dragging his wrist down. He ignored the clink of Mike and Jimmy's mugs in the corner and ignored Brenda yelling from the counter, "Who the hell put a wet umbrella on my register?" as he shouldered open the creaking back door. The howling gale, carrying the salty, fishy wrath of the Gulf of Mexico, smashed right into his face, instantly blowing off his flour-dusted chef's hat. Chuck squinted against the wind pressure, stepping over to the blue-painted, old-school diesel generator sitting against the back wall. This was his baby. He changed the oil and tightened the bolts every single week. The main grid could die 100 times, and this beast would still crank. He clenched the pipe wrench in his teeth and gripped the pull cord with both hands, his knuckles turning white. The first pull wavered in the wind. He spat out a mouthful of rainwater and tallow flakes, dropped his hips, threw his whole body weight backward, and yanked the cord with everything he had. The diesel engine sputtered and coughed twice, spewing a plume of black smoke that mixed with the rain. Then it violently roared to life, shaking the ground beneath it as blue exhaust rolled out the pipe into the storm. Current surged through the ancient copper wires straight up to the sign. The man-sized yellow Waffle House neon sign outside the diner flickered dimly twice. On the third flash, a blinding, warm yellow glare violently tore through the hurricane's rain curtain and smashed directly into the diner, painting itself dead center over Carus's night vision visor. The searing, warm yellow light instantly burned out Carus's active night vision imaging module. The pixels in his eyepiece exploded into a sheet of white static snow, and the auxiliary optical sensors completely flatlined due to the lens glare. Intense vertigo sent him stumbling backward. His boots skidded sideways on the fossilized grease of the tiles, and his lower back violently crashed into a row of bar stools, sending aluminum legs clattering everywhere. Carus gripped the scorching edge of his helmet and shook his head wildly, trying to reboot his visual systems. It wasn't until his knuckles brushed the communication antenna on the back of his neck that he realized the truth. The diner's air was so thick with sticky grease smoke and vaporized butter that his exposed resonance node was completely caked over. He mashed the call button 3 times, but the comms pod only fed him the white noise of static. Not a single syllable made it out. A chorus of gruff laughter erupted in the diner. The 2 guys in greasy work clothes were slapping the table, demanding their payout. The waitress wiping the counter just hollered in her raspy voice, "Don't track mud on my floor, and you're paying for any broken stools." Without even giving him a second glance, the cook gripping the massive pipe wrench was leaning against the flat top, silent as a grease-soaked stone, his eyes dead-locked on the back of Carus's neck. Relying on muscle memory, Carus fumbled for the front door, slamming his shoulder into the glass to bust it open. The hurricane hit him with a barrage of high-salinity rain, the salt water seeping right into his servo joints, making his old left leg injury throb. He stumbled down the steps, stepping into ankle-deep, lukewarm puddles, and blindly activated the manual emergency beacon on his arm armor. A crimson distress pulse began flashing sporadically in the sheets of rain. In low Earth orbit, a faint red alarm suddenly lit up the main console of the anti-gravity assault craft. Sailor stared at the small, persistent yellow thermal signature on the scanner, then made out the isolated silhouette of Carus's armor standing in the downpour. His finger was already raised, hovering over the activation key for airdrop authorization. He couldn't fathom why this tactic had failed. 30 minutes ago, he had severed every primary power grid within a 30-mile radius. According to standard Imperial combat protocols, the humans should have devolved into mass panic in the dark and the hurricane, surrendering without a fight. Yet, this tiny, palm-sized structure was still pumping out enough lumens to fry a top-tier imaging module. Carus's comms antenna was jammed tight by the damn airborne grease, and his armor joints were stuttering from overload after soaking in the storm's hypersaline floodwaters. He couldn't even manage an organized retreat. The visual organs beneath Seur's brow ridges narrowed into cold vertical slits. He concluded that the standalone diesel generator powering those lights had to be the core node of the human resistance. He pulled up the mech bay parameters, locked in 2 fully armed 50-ton heavy recon mechs, and input the landing coordinates, the Waffle House open-air parking lot. The anti-gravity system auto-calibrated for a flat foundation. Mission objective: crush the generator, flatten the structure. His knuckle dropped. The activation key flared with a piercing ghost blue light. The 2 encapsulated heavy recon mechs disengaged from the assault craft's racks, breaking through the atmosphere and plummeting toward the surface at high speeds, trailing scorching exhaust flames. The camera panned through layers of rain. Standing blind in the storm, Carus heard the approaching roar from the sky. He braced his injured leg, stood tall, and flexed his overloaded armor. 2 searing blue lights pierced the thick black clouds, illuminating his mud-spattered suit. The 2 heavy recon mechs had already descended to less than 100 meters above the parking lot. His taut nerves suddenly relaxed. Reflected in his blurred vision, the 2 50-ton heavy recon mechs drifted down steadily toward the open air lot, glowing with the pale blue halos of their anti-gravity field. 50 meters, 20 meters, 5 meters. He could already make out the intricate cooling grills on their massive foot armor. The ground began to vibrate faintly under the pressure of the anti-gravity fields. This time, the Empire's heavy armor would grind that obnoxiously loud diesel generator and the entire building into dust. These indigenes who dared humiliate an Imperial officer were going to pay. The second the mech's feet touched the parking lot, the anti-gravity fields let out a shrieking overload alarm. The storm surge had already turned the paved lot into a spongy Florida mud bog. When 100 tons of weight slammed down, the soft mud couldn't even begin to support the even weight distribution required by the precision anti-gravity systems. Both mechs sank simultaneously, swallowed up to their knee joints in the blink of an eye. The excitement on Carus's face froze instantly. He watched the mech's servo motors spin wildly, digging themselves deeper with every rotation. The saltwater-laced mud flooded into the core compartments through the seams, instantly clogging the exhaust ports. The mech's blue warning lights flashed 3 times before dying completely, leaving only the grinding whine of seized gears to carry on the wind. Beneath the howl of the hurricane, the distinct roar of a heavy diesel engine grew louder, pushing its way down the flooded, washed-out highway straight toward the parking lot. The hurricane battered the chassis of the Ford F-250, but the 40-inch mud tires chewed right through the ruined asphalt, the 8-cylinder diesel engine's guttural growl overpowering the 130 miles per hour wind. Cletus pulled his mud-flecked denim ball cap down a half-inch. Murky storm water churned and splashed wildly in his wheel wells. He had just driven 40 minutes through Garbage Road solely to chow down on 4 syrup-drenched hot waffles at the Waffle House, and the spot under the old oak tree at the lot's entrance. That was his designated parking space. Had been for 10 years. The lifted truck ground through the muck and swung into the lot. Cletus squinted at the yellow neon of the Waffle House, then at the 2 shiny, giant metal towers parked dead center in his spot. They were half buried in the swampy slop, their smooth metal hulls reflecting the neon light right into his eyes. What kind of jackass dumps their totaled construction equipment in my damn spot? Cletus yanked the parking brake, threw it in neutral, and left the engine idling loud. The wipers fought like hell against the downpour on his windshield. He shoved the door open, the freezing rain instantly soaking his flannel shirt. Thigh-deep, salty, muddy water immediately flooded his boots. Cursing a blue streak, he waded to the front bumper and ripped the waterproof canvas cover off his winch. That was a heavy-duty winch head just dropped $800 on last month, rated for 12,000 pounds. It had dragged half-ton steers out of the mud. It had hauled flipped sugarcane trailers out of ditches. If it was dead weight, this thing could pull it. He hooked a finger under the steel cable, thick as a man's wrist, and yanked a whole coil of it off the spool. Freezing rain battered the back of his neck. Cletus wiped a handful of muck off his face, slung the heavy steel hook over his shoulder, and swaggered through the sucking mud straight toward the nearest 50-ton recon mech. The transparent, bulletproof canopy of the cockpit was smeared with salty mud. Pilot A's knuckles were white from gripping the controls so hard, his holographic targeting reticle locked dead onto the human indigene swaggering through the muck. As an elite recon pilot of the Gal-Ax 6th Fleet, he had never encountered a situation this utterly absurd in his life. A 50-ton heavy recon mech, immobilized by a layer of soft sludge. Silt had jammed into every crevice of the servo joints. Aside from the neck turret, which could barely rotate, the entire chassis couldn't move a single inch. The cooling vents were totally clogged by the hypersaline floodwater, and the cockpit temp had already spiked to 104 degrees. The overload alarms were splitting his eardrums. He watched the stubble-faced human lugging a steel hook, completely ignoring the targeting turret, walk right up to the mech's most vulnerable point, the left hydraulic knee joint. It lacked plasma shielding to ensure full range of motion, a built-in weak spot. Pilot A mashed the firing button. A superheated thermal ray erupted forward, only to be instantly refracted by the sheer density of the torrential rain. The lethal high-temp beam dispersed into a harmless warm glow, doing nothing but splashing muddy water around the human's boots. The human just tilted his head, spat out a wad of gritty chewing tobacco, muttered some incomprehensible profanity, wiped the mud off his face, and bent down to jam the heavy steel hook violently into the hinge gap of the knee joint. He yanked the cable twice to test the tension, patted the mech's mud-caked hull, and turned around, swaggering his way back to the Ford pickup idling by the road. Pilot A shoved his control sticks like a madman, trying to lift the leg and break free. All he got was the scorched smell of fried servo motors and a chassis that sank another inch deeper. He watched helplessly as the human climbed into the cab. Through the mud-streaked glass, he saw the man reach up and throw it into gear. The winch drum began to spin. The thick, stiff steel cable went taut instantly, emitting a high-pitched whine like it was about to snap. The vibrating steel cable suddenly took on the full 12,000 pounds of tension, and the sharp crack of snapping metal mixed with the shriek of overloaded servos erupted in the rain. The 50-ton recon mech, buried waist-deep in the slop, didn't even have the chance to struggle. Its entire upper torso was violently jerked forward, face-planting into the swampy muck with a heavy thud. 2 feet of black sludge instantly smothered the frontal turret and all of its sensors. The only thing left visible was the back half of the turret, which spun wildly a few times before letting out a crackling short circuit and dying completely. Plumes of scorched blue smoke drifted out from the clogged exhaust vents, instantly ripped away by the gale. Cletus let off the gas, popped it out of gear, and yanked the parking brake. He hopped out, unhooked the cable, and let it spool back onto the winch. Dusting the mud off his hands, he climbed back into the cab. He threw it in reverse and eased back, backing the lifted truck perfectly into his newly vacated designated parking spot, his tires brushing the exact edge of the mud pit. Flawless execution. Chewing his tobacco, he rolled down the window halfway, spat out some loose flakes, and narrowed his eyes at the other recon mech, still stuck motionless in the mud 15 paces away. The shockwave from the snapping metal traveled through the mud and slammed into the cockpit of the second recon mech, making Pilot B's fingers go numb on his control sticks. He glanced down at the tactical display. Pilot A's red marker had completely flatlined, leaving nothing but a screen full of chaotic static. His own mech was nearly a quarter of the way submerged. Every twitch of the servo joints just forced more salty mud into the sealed seams. Pilot B made a split-second decision and cut all main power. Anti-gravity thrusters would only make him sink faster. He locked the cockpit hatch and huddled behind the observation screen, waiting for orbital reinforcement. Wiping the condensation off the screen, B watched the civilian Ford monster truck, belching thick black diesel smoke, back slowly toward him in low reverse, its mud tires kicking up roosters of black sludge. Before he could even pull up his weapons system, the guttural rumble of dozens of diesel engines suddenly joined the howl of the hurricane. One by one, blindingly pale headlights pierced the rain, neatly blocking off every single exit from the parking lot. More humans shoved their doors open and jumped out. Linemen in work gear carrying crowbars, ranchers in cowboy hats racking shotguns, and guys lugging half-full buckets of thick industrial grease, cursing and swarming toward him. A few big dudes climbed right onto the mech's shoulder armor and dumped entire buckets of grease straight down into the precision exhaust vents. B heard the short-circuit alarms immediately blare inside the armor, and the core temp warning light instantly bathed half his console in red. He frantically mashed his comms hotkey. The distress signal hit the saturated wall of grease smoke and salt spray, returning nothing but violent static. Clang. A heavy-duty spare tow cable was tossed from the front of the pickup, dropping perfectly into the servo gap of his mech's left knee. The winch motor hummed as it took up the slack, the cable inching tighter, emitting a nerve-grating shriek. Pilot B used the last of his strength to punch a scrambled SOS flare through the interference layer. The signal left a blazing trail as it shot straight toward the anti-gravity assault craft in low Earth orbit. In low Earth orbit, red alarms screamed across the main console of the Gal-Ax 6th Fleet's anti-gravity assault craft. Seur stared at the distress flare tearing across the holographic screen, his purplish-blue knuckles turning white from his death grip. The feed from the probes acted like a dull rasp, grinding away 30 years of his tactical expertise. 250-ton heavy recon mechs. One was mostly buried in black-brown sludge, its signal gone. The other was trapped in waist-deep muck, every single cooling vent choked with viscous yellow industrial grease, its core systems shorted out and dead, leaving only Pilot B's fading vitals blinking on the screen. He had severed the town's power grid, fully expecting the humans to wail and beg for mercy in the dark hurricane. He had deployed the Empire's proudest automated mechs, fully expecting to flatten the single small structure that dared to keep its lights on. And the result? A civilian diesel generator shrugged off the blackout, a patch of mud paralyzed their anti-gravity systems, and a bucket of industrial grease crippled 50 tons of military steel. This defied every known logic of interstellar warfare. Rage and pure absurdity choked Seur. He didn't believe in invincible defenses, he only believed in the high-energy plasma weapon in his hand. He personally secured his armor clasps, drew his sidearm, powered up his personal anti-gravity command pod, and plummeted right through the hurricane, dropping straight toward the Waffle House back alley. The anti-gravity system wobbled 3 times on the uneven, muddy ground before stabilizing. Seur kicked open the sealed hatch. The salty, fishy rain instantly drenched his armor, fine grit grating against his joint seams. He ignored it. Sloshing ankle-deep through the sludge, he bypassed stacks of empty waste oil drums and rotting takeout boxes. The deep, throbbing roar of the diesel engine rattled his armored chest cavity. That was the target. He gripped his searing hot plasma pistol, adjusted his wind-battered helmet, and rounded the corner of the brick alleyway. The 1,500 RPM old-school diesel generator was shaking the asphalt chunks in the alleyway. Chuck's knuckles were stark white as he gripped the pipe wrench. Freezing rain, mixed with the hot beef tallow vapor blowing out from the kitchen, plastered his wrinkled face. He had just tightened a loose fuel line when he saw Seur, decked out in gleaming silver armor, round the brick corner. Seur's helmet visor reflected the glaring yellow neon of the Waffle House. He aimed his glowing plasma pistol, locking the muzzle dead on the generator's cast iron block. His synthesized voice cut through the howling hurricane, heretical energy apparatus. "I will obliterate you." Chuck didn't retreat an inch. In his other hand, he held a massive stainless steel spatula, dripping with boiling hot beef tallow scooped straight from the griddle. Droplets of grease splattered into the mud, burning tiny craters. Before Seur could even pull the trigger, Chuck dropped his wrist and swung the spatula. It sliced through the wind and smacked precisely against the chassis of the pistol. Splat! Half a pound of scalding, electrically insulated beef tallow plastered directly into the pistol's cooling vents and trigger housing, instantly gumming up every conductive pathway. The previously humming, hyperheated plasma pistol let out a violent crackle, blew a cloud of blue smoke, and suffered an immediate core short. It clattered into the ankle-deep mud, so thoroughly coated it was barely recognizable, hissing out steam and the smell of burnt electronics. Chuck took one step forward, the mud rising to the ankles of his work boots. He aimed the jaws of the heavy pipe wrench right at Seur's visor. His gravelly voice overpowered the roar of the hurricane. "If you want hashbrowns, get in line. You touch my generator, and ill crack your damn helmet open. The gale hurled more rain at them. The glaring yellow neon swept across Seur's rigid armor, and the optical sensors behind his visor slowly hummed to life with a blue scanning glow. The scan swept diagonally through the cracked door into the warm, yellow-lit diner, every pixel flickering in disbelief at what it was processing. Over 30 humans were scattered across the greasy tile floor. A half-dozen truck keys were piled on the register counter. Every single person had a bona fide kinetic weapon at their waist or leaning by their feet. The freshly oiled barrels of AR-15s gleamed in the light. The breeches of 12-gauge shotguns were locked open, and crowbars and heavy wrenches were stacked in the corner like sacrificial offerings. He pulled up their heart rate telemetry. Over 30 data points, every single one pegged steadily between 60 and 75 beats per minute. Not a single spike, not an ounce of panic. The two linemen in work gear were slouched in a window booth, each with a $20 bill pinned under a syrup-stained menu. They were sipping from chipped coffee mugs, casually staring at the door as if waiting for a scheduled ritual. The middle-aged, grease-stained waitress had a cigarette clamped in her mouth, crouching on the floor scrubbing tallow out of the tile grout. She glanced up at his shadow, and her raspy voice drifted through the storm. "If you're hiding from the rain, come inside and order something. Otherwise, get out the damn alley and stop blocking the trash cans." Chuck stood motionless in front of the generator, resting the grease-caked pipe wrench casually on his shoulder. The rumble of the 8-cylinder diesel engine made the servo joints in Seur's knees vibrate. In the span of just 15 minutes, he had lost two 50-ton recon mechs and his personal plasma sidearm. His entire tactical squad had lost communications. The Empire's proud energy arsenal had been completely neutralized by beef tallow, mud, and muck. An independent power source that kept pumping steadily after the main grid was cut. Viscous, insulating fats perfectly deployed to paralyze Imperial energy weapons. A gravity trap meticulously prepared in the parking lot to swallow heavy mechs. The utterly fearless calm of all the civilians. This wasn't some ordinary roadside diner. This was a core stronghold of a storm response cult built around a diesel generator, specifically designed to counter the Gal-Ax 6th Fleet. Every grease stain, every inch of swampy mud, it was a deadly, painstakingly engineered defense network. The optical sensors behind Seur's visor shrank into blindingly bright blue dots. Trembling, he raised his armored gauntlet and pressed the emergency communicator on his neck. The residual scalding beef tallow on his fingertips smeared against the comms node but didn't trigger a short circuit. It was the one and only logical thing that had happened to him all day. A holographic tactical screen booted up on the inside of his visor. Only 3 pulsing red dots remained, himself, Carus limping around without comms, and Pilot B trapped in the mud with a dead core. Both 50-ton heavy recon mechs were wiped out. Plasma weapons completely destroyed. The hypersaline rain and sticky grease smoke had clogged every precision interface. The storm-surged parking lot was a custom-made gravity trap built explicitly to target anti-gravity tech. Over 30 human indigenes with heart rates as steady as cold-blooded killing machines, all packing kinetic weapons, rallied around a roaring diesel generator. This wasn't a roadside diner. This was a pre-planned cult ambush fortress, intended to lure the Gal-Ax fleet in deep. That endlessly roaring combustion engine was their storm god's sacrificial core. The grease and mud were directed energy weapons they had developed to crack Imperial tech. Seur's armored spine betrayed an uncontrollable shudder. He jammed his finger down on the maximum level retreat override code and roared a command to every unit in the fleet. All units, break orbit immediately. Abandon occupation parameters. Retreat to deep space at maximum velocity. The planetary defense capabilities vastly exceed projections. The hurricane blasted rain and foam against the hull of Seur's command pod, making his visor tremble. He severed the all-channel broadcast, turned, and marched back to his anti-gravity pod, parked in the alley. The wind and rain swept across the Waffle House's crooked yellow neon sign, tearing the slanted sheets of rain into fine mist. As the gray light of dawn just began to crest the horizon of the Gulf of Mexico, Brenda hauled an empty coffee pot over the fossilized grease tiles to the front door. Her eyes locked onto a limping shadow huddled in the dark of the entryway. Carus's armor was plastered in salty mud and bacon smoke, his active night vision totally blind. Gritting his teeth, he fished out a personal teleporter from a hidden armor compartment. His finger was just about to hit the activation button when a rough hand, dusted with waffle crumbs, slammed squarely into his chest plate. A crumpled bill was violently shoved into the seam of his chest armor. The edges of the paper were sticky with half-dried maple syrup. Carus froze. A piercing pain shot up his fractured shin, and his breath hitched in his throat. He was bracing for a shotgun blast or a pipe wrench to the face. Instead, all he got was a raspy, smoker's voice, deadpan as if taking an order. "You shattered my front door glass. That's $150. Cash." Inside the diner, Mike and Jimmy leaned out of their booth to watch. The $40 they'd just wagered on whether the alien would foot the bill was sitting right next to their hands, a shotgun propped casually against the table leg. Over by the V8 diesel generator, Chuck was wiping down his grease-caked heavy pipe wrench. Hearing the commotion, he raised his oversized spatula, letting it catch the cold light. Brenda slammed the empty coffee pot down on the wet threshold, the aluminum clanging loud over the rain. She shot a look at the teleporter clutched in Carus's hand and added, without a single inflection in her voice, "Pay up before you beam out of here. This is Waffle House. We don't do tabs." Out in the muck of the parking lot, the two 50-ton recon mechs were buried up to their necks. Cletus's lifted Ford F-250 was parked flawlessly in the newly opened spot, a faint wisp of blue diesel exhaust drifting from the tailpipe. The yellow neon of the Waffle House flickered in the wind, perfectly illuminating the plastic menu propped up by the register. Today's special. Hash browns and bacon. $4.99. Open 24 hours.
When I sat down to conceptualize this story, the core inspiration came from one of the most absurd yet genuinely badass indicators of modern resilience, FEMA's Waffle House Index. The fact that a federal government agency measures the destructive severity of a natural disaster by whether a local 24-hour diner is still serving hash browns, there is something profoundly hilarious and deeply human about that. In the sci-fi humanity? Fuck yeah. HFY genre, we usually see humans depicted as brilliant tacticians, elite space marines, or mad scientists outsmarting the galaxy. But I wanted to highlight an entirely different kind of human superpower, our sheer, unadulterated, blue-collar stubbornness. I wanted to pit an arrogant, hyper-advanced alien armada against a greasy hurricane-battered, late-night Florida diner. Writing this extreme contrast was an absolute blast. It was incredibly fun to strip away the grand space opera tropes and watch 50-ton Imperial anti-gravity mechs get utterly defeated by the holy trinity of southern roadside diners. Fossilized bacon grease, Florida swamp mud, and a redneck in a lifted Ford F-250. Commander Seur never stood a chance. He prepared for a textbook interstellar military engagement. He didn't prepare for Brenda, a grumpy waitress working a double shift on a sputtering diesel generator. To me, this story is a sci-fi love letter to the everyday folks, the people who keep the lights on and the world spinning when everything else is falling apart. It's a reminder that humanity's ultimate weapon isn't plasma cannons or energy shields. It's our ability to look an apocalyptic scenario dead in the eye, spit out a wad of chewing tobacco, and say, "You still gotta pay for that broken window." Thank you for reading. Carus to the stubborn, invincible, and utterly ridiculous survival instinct of humanity. May your black coffee always be strong, and your generators always fully fueled.